Number 1.
The Catskills were a peaceful place in the 1890s. Until one woman disrupted the peace by hiding bodies on her farm. The notorious Lizzie Halliday, one of America's most deranged early serial killers. After murdering at least 4 people, and likely many more, Halliday earned the moniker the worst woman on earth. Many also suspected her of the horrific Jack the Ripper murders. And not even a death sentence stopped Lizzie's killing spree. Lizzie Halliday was only 3 years old when she traveled from Northern Ireland to the United States. In 1879, she married for the first time. Over the next 14 years, she would walk down the aisle 5 more times. Was Lizzie unlucky, or did she play a role in her husband's high mortality rate? Whether these men died natural deaths or were murdered is not known, reported the New York Times in an 1894 article. But Halliday absolutely had a type. She picked older men, like veteran and pensioner Artemus Brewer and veteran George Smith. In a few months she tried to kill Smith by giving him a cup of poison tea, the Times explained. Failing in her design, she fled. Lizzie Halliday's life of crime included arson. While living in Vermont, she opened a shop and burned it to claim insurance money. The crime landed Halliday in prison for 2 years. After her first stint in prison, Halliday took a job as a housekeeper for Paul Halliday. The two married. Their married life does not seem to have been pleasant, the papers reported during her murder trial. Halliday stole a horse and rode off with a neighbor. That crime sent her to an asylum after she pleaded insanity. Paul, still faithful to his wife, welcomed her home from the asylum. "No fool like an old fool," he told papers. Instead of reforming her ways, however, Halliday set fire to their house, killing her stepson. After his son's death, Paul Halliday vanished. Wary of Halliday, neighbors asked after Paul, while the Black Widow insisted that her husband was simply away from the farm on travel. When Halliday wasn't looking, the neighbors searched the farm. Thanks to her track record of crime, many in the quiet community were convinced that she had killed her husband. But the searchers found something even more disturbing than one body. Hidden under a haystack in the Halliday barn, the searchers discovered the bodies of 2 women. They were mother and daughter Margaret and Sarah McQuillan. Halliday had lured them to the farm to murder them. Police swooped in to arrest Halliday for the murders. And when the authorities searched the farm, they found Paul Halliday's mutilated body stuffed under the floorboards. Lizzie Halliday wasn't a cooperative prisoner. During her pre-trial stint in jail, she attacked the sheriff's wife. She managed to start a fire in her cell. And she tried to commit suicide so many times, including once by cutting her own throat with broken glass, that the authorities chained her to the floor. From its circumstances, origin, conception, and execution, its unique characteristics, the abnormal personalities and peculiar localities it involves, and, above all, in the strangeness and mystery of its great central figure, it is unprecedented and almost without parallel in the annals of crime, the New York World declared. Reporter Nellie Bly visited Lizzie Halliday in prison to interview her. The Black Widow confessed to many other killings, telling the journalist, "It is a long story, and it is over many murders besides those already known." It was during Halliday's time in jail that authorities began to wonder if she had an even longer track record of crime. In 1888, a serial killer had tormented London. Known as Jack the Ripper, the murderer had never been caught. Sheriff Harrison Beecher dropped a bombshell in 1893. Recent investigations show that Mrs. Halliday is in all probability connected with the famous Whitechapel murders, the sheriff announced. The sheriff based his assessment on circumstantial evidence. Halliday had been in London around the time of the Ripper murders. She mutilated her victims. And Halliday kept bringing up the Ripper in prison. Mrs. Halliday is constantly speaking of those murders, the sheriff reported. She also talks of many women brought from New York who have been robbed, killed, cut up in small pieces, and dumped in the Hudson River. Lizzie Halliday went on trial for murder in 1894. The Sullivan County Court quickly convicted her of 3 murders, the McQuillans and her husband. Halliday almost certainly killed more people, but police could not connect her with other crimes. Her mistake had been hiding the bodies at her farm, where she could be easily connected to the killings. The jury sent Halliday to death row, making her the first woman in history sentenced to death by electric chair. But the court stepped in and commuted the sentence. Instead of sending Halliday to prison, she went to the Mattawan Hospital for the criminally insane. Halliday was a type of low humanity, according to one observer. She was an ignorant, mean, cunning, and revengeful woman, with the belief that she possessed a power to deceive everybody she chose. And Halliday continued to act out in the asylum. She attacked the staff and tried to escape. And in 1906, Halliday stabbed nurse Nellie Wickes 200 times with a pair of scissors. When she died, Wickers was cemented as the Catskills Ripper's final victim. The late 19th century saw the rise of a new phenomenon, killers who claimed multiple victims and murdered with brutal precision. But Jack the Ripper and H.H. Holmes weren't the only Victorian serial killers. Women like Lizzie Halliday and Mary Ann Cotton also racked up multiple killings. Female serial killers weren't exactly like their male counterparts, though. They were more likely to kill family members, for one. And they were less likely to use knives and guns. The murder weapon of choice for women was often poison. What drove Halliday to kill, and was she connected with the Jack the Ripper murders? She never let on. In some ways, Halliday broke the model for female serial killers. While she killed her husband and stepson, she also reportedly murdered strangers. While she attempted to kill with poison, she also used a gun, knives, and scissors. Like the Ripper, she mutilated her victims. Perhaps appropriately, when Lizzie Halliday died in the asylum in 1918, her obituary declared her the worst woman on earth.
Number 2.
On February 2, 1933, Christine and Lee Papin committed a gruesome crime. But were they motivated by madness, bloodlust, or class warfare? To this day, we still don't know. It's just one of the many questions about this perplexing case that has gone unanswered for nearly a century. Born into a dysfunctional, working-class family, the Papin sisters were raised by aunts, uncles, and a Catholic orphanage. Christine had wanted to become a nun, just like the girl's older sister, Emilia, but their mother forbade it. Instead, both Christine, born in 1905, and Lee, born in 1911, took up employment as the help for wealthier families. In 1926, the two sisters, who preferred to work together, took live-in positions as maids for René Lancelin, a retired solicitor who lived in Le Mans, France, with his wife Leonie and their adult daughter Genevieve. By all outward appearances, things were going well. The sisters ate the same food as the rest of the family, lived in heated rooms, and were paid the standard wage of the time. Christine in particular was praised for her cooking and needlework. What wasn't so apparent was that the sisters worked 14-hour days, with only one half-day off each week, and that Leonie Lancelin was a demanding mistress who often performed white glove tests throughout the house and chastised the two maids severely for any perceived failings. On the night of February 2, 1933, the Lancelins were supposed to meet for dinner at the home of a family friend and weren't expected back at the house until late. Leonie and Genevieve had been out shopping, and when they returned home before dinner to find the house dark, the mistress of the house was not pleased. According to Christine and Lee Papin, the power had gone out when Christine plugged in a faulty iron. Since the family wasn't expected home until late, the sisters had decided to wait until the following morning to have the iron repaired. The sisters later testified that when they told Leonie about what happened, she flew into a rage and attacked them on the landing of the stairs. At first, the two sisters were just defending themselves, especially when Genevieve joined in the fray. Or so they said. But their ire quickly went far beyond self-defense. The two sisters gouged out the eyes of their employers and, once the women were blinded and unable to fight back, beat them with a pewter pitcher and a hammer, then stabbed them with a knife taken from the kitchen. Observers of the crime scene later noted that it appeared as though the women's bodies had been scored like the loaves of bread that Christine prepared each day. Once they were done, they locked all the doors in the house and went up to their room, taking only a candle for light. That evening, when his wife and daughter didn't arrive at dinner as planned, René Lancelin became concerned. Returning home and finding the house dark and all the doors locked, he fetched the police. The police climbed over a garden wall to access the house, where they found the gruesome crime scene. Both women had been beaten and mutilated to the point that they were almost impossible to recognize. Leonie's eyes were found in the folds of the scarf around her neck, One of her daughter's eyes was found underneath her body, the other on the stairs. When the police broke open the door to the sisters' room, they expected to find Christine and Lee in a similar state. Instead, they found them huddled together in bed, naked. A candle was burning and there was a hammer on a nearby chair, with blood and bits of hair still clinging to it. Upon being questioned by the police, the sisters immediately confessed. The story of the gruesome murder caused a firestorm in the media. Psychologists came to the defense of the women, arguing both that the two sisters were suffering from folie à deux, otherwise known as shared psychosis or shared delusional disorder. Meanwhile, notable French thinkers declared that the attack was a manifestation of class warfare, the inevitable result of the mistreatment and exploitation of the working class by the wealthy. Among those who discussed and analyzed the case were such notable French intellectuals as Jean-Paul Sartre, Jacques Lacan, and Jean Genet. As for the sisters themselves, their explanation was simpler. "I'd rather have had our bosses' hides than for them to have had ours," Christine declared. While the sisters claimed self-defense, their representation cited a family history of mental illness, including a cousin who had died in an asylum and an uncle who had committed suicide. The court was having none of it, however, and decided that the two sisters were guilty after only 40 minutes of deliberation. Christine was sentenced to death by guillotine, while Lee, who was the meeker of the two and was considered to have been in the thrall of her dominant older sister, was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. Separation of the siblings proved to be particularly hard on Christine. The elder sister suffered bouts of depression and even one episode in which she attempted to claw out her own eyes, an event that led to her being confined to a straitjacket and also contributed to the commutation of her sentence to life in prison. At one point, authorities relented and allowed the two sisters to see each other again, at which time Christine reportedly threw herself at Lee and began unbuttoning her blouse. This, along with their having been found in bed together in the aftermath of the murders, led some to suspect an incestuous relationship between the two siblings. What we do know is that Christine eventually stopped eating, at which time she was transferred from the prison to a mental hospital in the city of Rennes. However, on May 18, 1937, she died of cachexia, more commonly known as wasting, as a result of refusing to eat. Lee fared better, serving only 8 years of her 10-year sentence before moving to the town of Nantes under an assumed identity. There, she made a living for herself the only way she knew how, as a maid. Lee Papin is thought to have died in 1982, though Claude Ventura, a French film producer, claims that he encountered her when he was working on the 2000 documentary En quête des sœurs Papin, or In Search of the Papin Sisters. The woman that he claimed was Lee had suffered a stroke which rendered her partially paralyzed and unable to speak. She died in 2001. In Search of the Papin Sisters wasn't the only film on the subject. The crime has served as the inspiration for dozens of books, movies, plays, songs, television shows, comic books, paintings, and even an opera. Perhaps the most famous example is Les Bons, The Maids, a 1947 play by Jean Genet that is still staged to this day and has since been adapted to film. The story of the Papin sisters captured the attention of journalists, intellectuals, and psychologists of the time, and it has continued to fascinate storytellers in the years since. Though we may know what motivated the sisters to become killers, it's a story that we have told one another over and over in an effort to understand this brutal and shocking crime.
Number 3.
Sharon Tate was only 26 years old when she, along with her unborn child, 3 of her friends, and a stranger with bad timing were murdered. Tate, a Golden Globe-nominated actress most known for her role in Valley of the Dolls, was also the wife of French-Polish film director Roman Polanski. On August 9, 1969, Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, noted hairstylist Jay Sebring, aspiring screenwriter Wojciech Frykowski, and Frykowski's girlfriend Abigail Folger, book editor and heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, had their lives taken from them at 10,050 Cielo Drive in Los Angeles' Benedict Canyon. The murders, soon to be referenced in Quintino's upcoming Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, were carried out by members of Charles Manson's family in what's been described as a vengeful act. Manson, who had aspirations of becoming a musician, had previously attempted to get a record deal from producer Terry Melcher, son of Doris Day, who had once rented the house along with musician Mark Lindsay and Melcher's then-girlfriend, actress Candice Bergen. Reports claim Melcher's snub of Manson left him agitated and disgruntled, leading him to take his revenge on Hollywood. Manson allegedly instructed Tex Watson to take Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel to that house, where Melcher used to live, and to totally destroy everyone in it, as gruesome as you can, according to Helter Skelter. The True Story of the Manson Murders, an account written by the Manson trial's prosecuting attorney Vincent Bugliosi. What happened next, many say, changed the tide of Hollywood. Joan Didion wrote of the event in her 1978 essay The White Album. Many people I know in Los Angeles believe that the 60s ended abruptly on August 9, 1969, ended at the exact moment when word of the murders on Cielo Drive traveled like brushfire through the community, and in a sense this is true. The tension broke that day. The paranoia was fulfilled. According to Helter Skelter, shortly after midnight on August 9, Watson was first to enter the home. He encountered a sleeping Frykowski and proceeded to kick him in the head. When Frykowski asked who he was and what he was doing there, Watson allegedly replied, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." Atkins, on Watson's direction, reportedly found the house's other occupants, and Watson tied Tate and Sebring together by their necks with rope that he then slung from the ceiling beams. According to Bugliosi, when Sebring protested the rough treatment of pregnant Tate, Watson shot him. Helter Skelter says that Frykowski and Folger both fought against their captors to no avail. They were repeatedly stabbed 51 and 28 times, respectively. Reportedly, back in the house, Tate was pleading for her life and the life of her child. She told the Manson clan of her wish to be allowed to live long enough to have her baby and offered herself up as a hostage in exchange. It's not known whether either Atkins, Watson, or both killed Tate, who was stabbed 16 times, but Linda Kasabian, the Manson family member who was a witness in the murder trial, later said in the dramatized documentary Manson that Tate cried out for her mother during the attack. "I saw a woman in a white dress, and she had blood all over her, and she was screaming, and she was calling for her mom. I saw Katie stabbing her," said Kasabian in the film. Before leaving for Cielo Drive, Manson allegedly instructed the women to leave a sign, something witchy as a signature after the murders, according to Helter Skelter. The book goes on to explain that Atkins used Tate's blood to write "pig" on the front door. The bodies were found the next morning by Tate's housekeeper, Winifred Chapman, and in the driveway police later saw Stephen Parent, who had been visiting the property's caretaker, William Garrettson, shot dead in his car. On the front lawn lay the bodies of Frykowski and Folger, and inside the house, the bodies of Tate and Sebring were found in the living room still connected by the long rope tied around each of their necks, 4 feet apart from each other. Months passed before Charles Manson and his followers were identified as the prime suspects, and on April 19, 1971, the 4 were sentenced to death.
Number 4.
Issei Sagawa was born into wealth in April of 1949 in Japan. Despite a normal childhood, Sagawa later admitted that as early as the first grade he would look at the body parts of others and find himself desiring to have their flesh in his mouth. When Issei reached sexual maturity, he took to having sex with his dog. He also began to look at women and desperately wanted one to maim and devour. He held off turning these thoughts into actions until he turned 23, at which point he followed a woman home and waited. When Sagawa felt she was sleeping, he broke into her apartment and attempted to hold her down. Sagawa was much smaller than the tall woman, and she knocked him to the floor and alerted the authorities. Issei was picked up by the police on an attempted rape charge. He didn't tell the police his true motive was one of cannibalism. When he turned 28, Sagawa's parents paid for him to go to school in France for literature. It was there, away from his parents, that Sagawa began to pay for prostitutes. He would bring them to his home with the intention of shooting and eating them, but he chickened out each time he tried. Things went along like this for years. Then in the summer of 1981, the now 32-year-old Sagawa convinced his classmate Renee Hardeveld to come to his place for a study session. Issei saw her as a tall goddess and himself as a tiny ogre of a man. He told himself that killing and eating her would put her energy into his body. When Hartevelt arrived, she began to read poetry at a desk. Sagawa snuck up behind her with a rifle and shot her in the neck. The shock and ecstasy of the moment overtook him, and he fainted. Once he woke up, he began to rape his dead classmate. He then tried to tear open her flesh with his teeth, but found himself unable to do so. Sagawa had to go out and buy a butcher knife, which he then used to dismember Hartevelt's body. Issei then spent the next 2 days eating different parts of her body. An attempt was then made to dump the rest of her remains in a lake, but he was caught in the act and arrested. Sagawa's father willingly paid for a defense lawyer for his son. Things dragged along as Issei spent 2 years awaiting a trial. Finally, it was decided to hold a competency meeting, at which Sagawa was found to be legally insane and ordered to be placed in a mental asylum. A Japanese author flew to Paris to meet Sagawa soon afterwards, and they collaborated on a book called In the Fog together. It covered Sagawa's version of the murder and aftermath. The book drew unwanted publicity on the French authorities, and a decision was made to work on transferring Sagawa back to his home country. Once he arrived in Japan, psychologists at the mental hospital there studied Sagawa and determined he was a sexual pervert, but not insane. Since the French authorities had dropped the charges against Issei and the court documents were sealed, there was nothing legally binding to have Sagawa held in custody, so in August of 1986, he checked himself out of the hospital and returned to civilization a free man. Over the next 11 years, Sagawa used his infamy to get himself booked as a guest speaker. He also wrote a book about his crimes and another true crime book on a different case. He dabbled as a restaurant reviewer for a magazine and even appeared in a movie playing the role of a sexual sadist. By the later 1990s, Sagawa struggled to find anyone willing to pay for his writings and found his reputation made getting a normal job basically impossible. Once his parents died in 2005, he ended up moving into public housing and admitted to having to seek welfare. Sagawa has subsequently said that his past has created a miserable existence for him now. He still resides in Tokyo to this day. Let's just hope when he gets hungry that Sagawa sticks with McDonald's. Isidore Fink unwillingly became a part of New York crime lore when he was murdered in 1929. The 30-year-old Fink owned a small laundry service store in New York City. The neighborhood was rough, so Fink kept his windows locked and nailed shut and kept his business door locked, even during working hours. His customers complained about the inconvenience, but Fink was more worried about robbery than keeping his customers satisfied. On the night he died, Fink retired to his living quarters, which were located in the same building as his business. Around 10:30 at night, a neighbor heard a terrible scream and summoned a police officer. The lawman could not access the home as the windows were tightly closed and too small to fit through. The doors were locked as well. A transom window was found to be open, and so the officer found a small-statured neighborhood boy to squeeze through and open the door. Fink was found dead on the ground. 3 bullet holes, 2 in the chest and 1 in the wrist, were obvious. Suicide was the first reaction from the police, but no gun could be located. Money was found in Fink's pockets and the money drawer from his business, so robbery was ruled out as a motive. His customers could provide no link to any known enemies. The idea that someone shot him through the transom window was offered up, but powder burns on Fink showed a close-range shot. Someone would have to have been small or flexible enough to sneak through the transom window, shoot Fink and then sneak out. But why would they have chosen to wiggle through a tiny window instead of just unlocking the door and fleeing? The police tried to find trapdoors and hidden doorways, but came up empty at every angle. The crime was never solved.